Objects tell us stories about the past, and by studying and recreating them, they help build our knowledge about those who came before. Learn more with Pottsgrove Manor as we talk with skilled artisans who share what they have learned as they work in Remaking the Past. We're joined today by Jeff Pavlik of Old World Bread. He is a baker, researcher, all-around cool guy, and he's joining us all the way from Michigan. Jeff, thank you so much for taking your time. I'm especially excited to have this conversation because I've had the benefit of participating in one of your workshops. So I already know a lot of the cool things that you have to share with our viewers today.
Thanks. It's great to be back virtually at Pottsgrove. It's a phenomenal place. So
We like it. We're partial to it. So we're going to jump in here, and I would love for you to give, a brief rundown of who you are, how you got your start.
I was born into a military family, so I moved around the world, lived in Korea. I grew up in Germany, came to the United States for college. Have a degree in American history from the University of Missouri, Columbia, as well as another degree in interdisciplinary studies, peace studies. And then I worked in museums. That was kind of my goal. And then I ended up owning a bakery. So I ran the bakery. I owned it for 2 dozen years. During that time, I continued studying. I continued teaching at museums and studying historic bread making. Then a few years ago, I sold the bakery, and now I've been teaching, going to museums. I've been to Pottsgrove several times, teaching using that phenomenal oven that you all built there. Currently, though, I'm a culinary arts teacher at a high school right outside Detroit in Warren, Michigan. And I still do museums. I'm a certified interpreter, National Association of Interpreters, and a wide array of interests that I have that I lecture on and teach.
We'll start with asking you if there is maybe something that got you going down the bread rabbit hole, maybe an original receipt or a bake oven you happen to come across.
Grew up in Germany, so I ate my fair share of pretzels and brochen, and actually, I think I got my start in ninth grade. We were in Vienna, and we had to do a class project, and it had to just be something to do with history and Vienna. I picked mine, the soccer torte. There's two restaurants in Vienna, both claim fame to this famous cake. So I just spent my ninth grade year tasting, going back and forth and tasting each cake, and then I reproduced them for class. So really, the idea of reproducing historic baked goods, I kind of trace back to this strange 14-year-old boy who was obsessed with nail the correct version. So yeah, it's been kind of a strange passion of mine for a long time. Yeah.
Genius level. I'm a little mad I never thought to combine cake with school studies.
When I finally had to do something with my life, I ended up owning a bakery, which was very practical, very physical, daily grind, standing that process of waking up every day, making bread every day, attunes you to the historic parts of it because in many ways, the process of bread making hasn't changed, in thousands of years, and the physicality, the labor of bread making for both men and women, whether it be domestic or production, it's still the same amount of labor that you put in. Historic bread making and modern bread making are very different. There's definitely the small details, the things that we have to study, the things that we have to dive into, the records, the historic records, and try to understand those minutia. I like to, when I bake at a museum, leave a loaf out. You hope that some ghost walks by and recognizes it. The purpose of historical reproduction and historical, study is to try to get as close as we can to what they tasted, what they went through and what they would recognize. That's kind of the goal, at least my goal. And in some ways, bread is bread, but those differences are what bring you closer to the past and allow us to experience what people experience.
But was there anything that surprised you? When we were doing our workshop, I really liked the notion of bread is still kind of made with the same ingredients as it has been, as you mentioned, for thousands upon thousands of years. Is there anything that sort of really made you sit up and go, wow, huh?
We now have something called bread flour, right? If we're making bread, people like to use the type of bread they use for flour is really high gluten. It has a lot of elasticity, a lot of extensibility to it. It absorbs a lot of water. So you're able to manipulate it, ply it, stretch it. It rises more. It has more loft, different taste to it. And, one of the things that I try to do is actually use kind of cheaper flour, all-purpose flour. And the reason being is that it has less of that gluten. I mean, some of that gluten that we have accessibility to now would have been prized for people in the 18th century. And cookbooks that say, an American flour will yield, 3 to 4 pounds more bread per pound of flour. Why? Because it soaks up more water. So I mean, there was people noticed the differences in flour. So even though we're still using flour from the same plant, it's not been genetically modified. It's just that different regions are able to grow higher gluten flour. Using kind of lower gluten flour allows us to kind of understand better that process, what they were actually able to get out. We can see this in like recipes because they'll oftentimes give like an amount of water to the amount of flour. So we can kind of judge how these things, work, these recipes work if we're using ingredients that are closer to the ingredients that they had access to. We have one reference, a soldier, an English soldier in Boston, saying that he took 7 pounds of flour and he gave it to his baker, and then they returned to them 2 5-pound loaves. So those kind of things are recipes. So this is what I've been working on a lot lately. So we can use a basic formula. We know kind of the algorithm of how bread works, and we can deduce the recipe by basing it on knowledge of just a few facts. That if we're trying to make it so that, they weighed the beginning, they weighed the end, we can kind of, manipulate the middle, and it might not be to our palate, it might not be to our taste, but that's the bread that they got. So we're able to do that. And so some of that's kind of surprises to me.
In your research, living history, through the process of making this bread that ghosts would give the thumbs up to, have you found what types of breads 18th century people would come to expect or would feel comfortable or good about eating?
First thing is people expect it to weigh the same. Scales are really important in baking. The symbol of bakeries are generally like scales, and scales have been an important part of the bread making process. And most people's, first of all, their expectation is that they get the amount of bread they're paying for. It's really easy to cheat that. Sawdust or chalk or additives that people don't want to eat. It's really easy to short weight your bread. If you were buying a loaf of bread, you bought it by the weight. You had an expectation that X amount of grain is going to yield X amount of bread. But bread also differs by place. Benjamin Franklin, when he leaves his home in Boston, goes down to Philadelphia when he's a teenager. He went to the baker and he asked the baker for a 3-penny loaf. And they're like, we don't sell 3-penny loaves, because a lot of bread was sold on a size. That is, the government was regulating how much bread you get based on how much money you paid. And that differed based on the quality of wheat, like how much it was sifted. If you were buying a loaf of bread that was nearly unsifted, like a whole wheat bread, there was less labor involved because it had less sifting. So you could get a larger loaf of bread for that 3 pennies. If you got one that was middling sifted, had most of the outer bran removed, but it wasn't white bread, you might get a smaller loaf. It might be you might get a pound for 3 pennies of whole wheat bread, and you'd get a smaller amount of bread for the same amount of money because it was further sifted. If you want it like a white bread, you'd probably just get like a roll because that took the most amount of labor to produce. And so for that same amount of money, you could get 3 different breads. When Benjamin Franklin goes and asks for a 3-penny loaf, they're like, "Oh, we just don't sell 3-penny loaves." He was like, "Okay," like gets instead he's like asked for rolls, and he gave him his money, and he said he got 3 large rolls. He was surprised at the amount of bread that he got for that amount of money. So his expectation was he wasn't looking for like a flavor of bread or a type of bread or a named bread or a recipe bread. He was just looking for a 3-penny bread. And he comments that, they don't do the same things that we do. And it was like, what, 200 miles away,
Yeah,
and yet it's a totally different bread culture,
yeah.
And when we go to the grocery store, we kind of like, we see different types of bread and we have names for different kinds of breads. Your recipe was really based on how much it was sifted, and that was the kind of bread that you were going to be getting, and then people knew that there was, different ways of making bread. They differentiate bread by substance, but not by kind of name classification.
And I think that's an important point is, not all flours are the same even today as they were in the 18th century. Going back to sort of basics for those who don't make bread or don't spend a lot of time around flour, you can really change the consistency of a flour by sifting it. So if you would talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So a grain of wheat It's a little seed. The outer part of it's called the bran, and that is the husk. That's where we get our fiber from. It accounts for about 10% or so of the actual total wheat that we have. At the bottom of that wheat is a germ, and the germ is the part that will reproduce. That has all the vitamins and ability to sprout. The middle part of that grain is what we call the endosperm. That's where we get flour from. So when we grind our flour, we're separating out those three parts. And the bran is something that people just don't want. This idea of, white flour being bad and, whole wheat flour being good is something that we kind of take on now because we want more fiber in our diet and it's healthier, et cetera. But that oldest loaf of bread that we have, when you look at it, these pieces under an electronic microscope, what they note is that none of them are that big, that the flour is actually sifted, that some other they too were trying to get towards white flour. The goal has been white flour because we enjoy it more. Now it's inverted. Now whole wheat breads are expensive and white bread's the cheapest. For most of history, white bread's been the expensive thing and whole wheat flour has been, the cheap thing. We have some sifters here. We have this one here is a horsehair sifter. People have figured out ingenious ways of sifting flour. I mean, to get that bran out of it, to let the flour fall through and the bran to stay on top is a goal. But this is a native style sifter. Here in North America, we're sifting their corn flour. That this idea of sifting off kind of that particular matter is nothing new. Is by the 18th century, we had figured out wire. You start having in the 18th century is large bolting machines that the flour gets sifted through it and then falls through various types of mesh, whether they be silk or, cloth, or then later wire. And once you have a wire screen, you can have that wire to be exactly the size that you need it. It's listed down as, 24 by 23. It says it right here. When you sift through that, you generally lose about 18% of your outer husk. And so you're getting not white flour, but you're getting whiter flour. And so, this is just a common sifter that most people would have in their home. And we see sifters in, period paintings. And that bran could be reused for fodder for animals. They would keep the bran and, as a part of their feed and then resell it to someone. The actual millers that were making large quantities of flour, they would know when to keep sifting it. And each of those types of flour had a different purpose. We think of flour as either being, whole wheat or white. We don't have a lot of the middle kind of flour. Like I said, a lot of these recipes are based upon the type of flour that they were making for a specific style of bread.
So, Jeff, one of the questions that we've been asking Remaking the Past series participants is one that I wasn't actually even going to ask you because the answer seems obvious. It's what are some challenges in studying originals? Because, I don't really know that a lot of 18th century bread exists, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, I mean, it's true, right? We don't have a whole lot of 18th century bread that exists. One of the things I do love studying are biscuits, ship's biscuits, because we do have some of these left. We actually have a whole lot. We have one from the 18th century, and then we have a whole lot from the 19th century. It's one of the few breads that we still have left because most bread has too much water in it, so it tends to mold. Biscuits are dehydrated thoroughly so that they don't mold. And we see a lot of bread culture in them. Like this is one that was made with this press here. And what we note, and this is based off an original, it's from the late 18th century, early 19th century. It was standardized. And what we see is something that bakers had to do a lot of, which is claim their goods, make your mark. You had to make sure you knew whose bread that was, so that if it was sold underweight, or it was rotten, or if it was full of sawdust, they knew who to come back to. So, like in these biscuits, we can actually see, this is the king's mark, the mark that this is a royal paid for by the crown, so they're marked with who owns it. And then there's a W right here, which meant Woolwich. So each factory that was making these in England and sending them over marked where it was made. Bakers actually had to claim their good because it was, again, a very highly regulated trade. It was life or death. Bread was the basis of a subsistence. It made up over 30 to percent, 40% of your calories per day.
How do you see bread factoring into the everyday lives? Would you say they eat more bread than us today? Obviously, we've talked about how it's different.
Yeah, definitely. It's your largest source of carbohydrate. It's the basis of your diet. That we do have a few recipes laid out. We look at how much they say to make for a family. If you took, that bushel of flour and they say, this will yield so many loaves of bread, and you'll do this once a week kind of thing. You can kind of figure out that most people are eating, over about a pound and a half of bread a day. Like that's what people are looking for is a pound and a half of bread a day, the basis of what a human being would want.
That's
And
an astonishing amount of bread.
it
But
really is.
yeah,
It really is. That's where you're getting your energy from. Basic form of substance. We're not eating sandwiches, a lot of it
yeah.
is going to be drier bread. Oftentimes bake days were, say twice a week. So you're baking on, say, Wednesday and Saturday. Your Saturday bread's going to last you until Wednesday, Thursday, and your Wednesday bread's going to last you until, Sunday, Sunday, and then Saturday. It just keeps carrying over. You're not going to want to like run out of bread. I mean, that's just the goal is not.
Unthinkable. Unthinkable.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're always going to be eating bread. So it's not always going to be soft and squishy and right out of the oven. You're going to be eating bread that's going to be firmer and is going to be denser, but it also prevents it from molding as quickly. In stews, you're adding water to it. It's generally going to be either dunked into a liquid and eaten, with a liquid, or it's going to be toasted. If you have older bread, toasters were just a common household item. Why?
Mm.
Because bread gets stale. And when we warm bread up, it actually comes back alive. And eating harder bread was just a norm, that biscuits were a norm.
But you
Um,
wouldn't necessarily be eating them hard. You're finding ways
yeah,
to
you're adding
rehydrate them.
you're
Yeah.
adding into hot water, into stews, into
Right.
a lot of dishes are juicy, that we're finding ways of getting this bread to become more supple.
Two-part question.
Sure.
Number one, do you have a favorite type of bread or a favorite recipe that you follow from this time period? And then second part of that question is take us through that process. Say you are at a reenactment gig, you're waking up, you're making bread. What does that look like for you? At the
Okay.
very beginning, we talked about really the labor of making bread, but take us through that process.
We start a lot of times with a sponge the night before, and that's a pretty common process in 18th century baking, is that you start a small amount of flour, water, and liquid, and then that starts to ferment. In the morning, the first thing I do is add my first set of flour and water to that. So I take that 10,000 yeast, and I'm going to try to multiply it to 50,000 yeast, and then I'm going to give it a little while, and then I'll come back to it and add more flour and water. And so I keep building my bread. Generally, by the time we get to the kneading stage, where we actually have to kind of knead the dough, that's where I try to make, half a dozen friends or more from around the camp. When I do bake, I try to bake a lot. I mean, baking a loaf of bread is awesome, and there's, if that's what you get done, that's great. I personally like to fill the oven.
Yeah.
I like to try to see like how much bread can we make? What is the labor to making this much bread? Because people weren't just making a loaf of bread. They all start with, a peck of flour, which is 14 pounds. It's more fun with more people. So
Yeah.
we kind of, put more arms and strength into it and, get everyone mixing and kneading. And then you have to have a place to put it. You have to have a place for these things to ferment. You have to have a place for it to be laid out. And then you have to have kind of a regulated system. Baking is a orderly system that we have to go from, step one to step two to step three. So we line up benches and tables, things that we can manipulate near the oven because it needs to rise. We need to give it time. And a lot of it has to do with timing. If people are hoping to eat, have bread out of the oven by noon, it might mean we have to start it the night before and then wake up at 6 a.m. and then get it going. First rise by 7, and then the second by 8, and then the third part by 9. We're kneading it all, forming it by 10, letting it rise to 11, and then getting in the oven by, that means that we have to manipulate the oven. We have to have the oven hot enough. Then we have to get it cool enough because generally the oven, we're getting up to, 800 degrees minimum, then trying to cool it back down to 450, and then we can start loading bread up. So a lot of that's just timing. If it all works right by that noontime when people expected bread to be ready.
We're almost out of time, but I
Sure.
want to end with asking you, do you have a particularly good memory about your time making historic bread?
Yeah, like every time. I mean, I
Yeah, can't pick one.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always a good time. Bread is one of these things that's, very quintessentially human. And I built a bread oven in Holland, Michigan. They have a tulip festival, and I was doing 17th century Dutch baking, as a kind of a side reenacting project. What I loved was that people would come up and they would be like, "Oh, that oven. We have that kind of oven in Mexico." I'm like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's the same thing." And then get someone from like India that's like, "Oh, in India we have an oven just like that." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then someone from
Mhm.
Egypt, like, in Egypt we have an oven just like that. And then someone from Poland, my Polish grandmother had an oven just like that. And it just didn't matter. People from all around the world relate to these things. They're like, "Oh, bread making, like, ovens." Like this is what we do. Like we do this in our continent, in our continent, in our continent, in our continent. And yes, it's just universal. One of my favorite things is meeting people from around the world because American history is kind of niche to, what we're really into. We're really into American history. We want to tell you about American history of this, time period. But people relate to ovens, people relate to bread, people eat, people have used flour, some sort of grain is being used everywhere around the world to make food. And so it's an instant way of connecting, and that's really what we're trying to do as interpreters is have a relationship and make these things that we're trying to explain relatable to them. Nothing more relatable than bread.
Well, I think that's a powerful place to end on the connection of bread that binds us all, right,
For
together.
sure.
I'm gonna need to shut this down and go get a piece of bread immediately.